Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So we are delighted to have Professor Catherine DeMuth today. She's normally at Brown University at the Cognitive and Linguistic Science, and this year she's at the Institute for Learning and Brain Science at University of Washington studying child language acquisition. And I think it's very interesting for us to have a view on how children learn language when we are desperately trying to teach computer how to acquire language. So without further ado, here's Professor DeMuth.
Thank you, Sami. Thanks very much for having me here today. As Sami said, I also have always been interested in how children learn language and how computational tools and computational approaches to linguistics are so far apart in their fields. And yet I think there are certain insights from both fields that can help inform some of the types of work that are done in some of the other fields. So I'm not sure that what I have to say today will have direct relevance for any of your work, but you might have some insights into some of the types of problems that either you or other people are doing in the field, especially of speech recognition or generation, that might be relevant here. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of background. Some of the issues I'm going to be talking about today are issues that have come out of the acquisition literature. One of the problems in children's early speech, as you may be aware, having listened to any child, is that grammatical morphemes are variably produced. Okay? So typically this has been seen as being a morphosyntactic problem. And syntacticians in the field of language acquisition have spent a lot of time trying to build theories about why and how this happens. So typically people think that, say for instance, if tense and agreement morphemes, third person singular morphemes, are missing, this means that children have incomplete syntactic representations. Okay? And so there are various theoretical approaches built to try and understand why and how this changes over time. Over the years, I've become very dissatisfied with a lot of syntactic approaches to this problem. One of the reasons that it has been less than satisfying is that nobody has an account of why some of these things are variable. So why do kids sometimes include third-person singular morphemes and sometimes not? And is this just a random process, or is there something that's more principled about how that happens? So to address some of these issues, we had a little bit of evidence that I'll show you today from some of the African languages that I worked on that this is not a random process. But it was difficult to address these issues until we really had a database that had the types of data to be able to look at these things systematically. So over the past 6 years, we got funding from NIH to actually collect a large database of children's early speech. Basically, there was nothing available in the public domain between 1 and 2. And when you're starting to look at grammatical morphemes, a lot of them actually start before the age of 2, and yet most of the data that we had started after the age of 2. So what I wanted was a database that would allow us to sort of track the emergence of grammatical morphemes over time so that we could look to see where and how these things began to be variably produced. And the hypothesis here is that some of the variability is phonologically constrained. Okay? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So in doing some of this work, another hypothesis that we had is that a lot of things are statistically driven. That a lot of some of the variability that we find, especially across languages, is due to higher frequency types of things are learned first. So we've been pushing the statistical part of things, and some of this has been also joint work with Mark Johnson and colleagues and students. But then we've also found that there are limits to the statistical part of things. And so what I'll be talking to you about today doesn't have a lot of statistics in it because I think this problem isn't as tractable from a statistical approach as some of the other issues we've looked at. Okay, So children exhibit variable production of certain grammatical morphemes. So sometimes you see determiners used here, and I'll use determiners basically in talking about English for the and okay? And also inflectional morphemes like third person singular. So a lot of people have had syntactic and semantic approaches to this problem in the past. However, there are various limitations to this. As I mentioned, these approaches don't explain why the production of grammatical morphemes is variable, and they also don't capture some of the cross-linguistic differences that we find. So we find, for instance, that children learning Spanish produce determiners lots earlier than children learning English. We also find that Italian-speaking children have no problem with person tense marking. They do it just fine, whereas English-speaking children persist in having problems with this for a long period of time. So these approaches suggest that semantics and syntactics are not the full story here, that something else is actually going on. Over the years, there's been a certain amount of work looking at phonological approaches to this problem. And so the hypothesis that I'm going to pursue here is that children's first grammatical morphemes are, in fact, prosodically unlicensed prosodically unmarked or prosodically licensed. And I'll explain what that means. So there was some early work by Luann Gerken, now at University of Arizona, where she ran an experiment looking at the contexts in which children will actually produce determiners or articles. So if you look in the first case here, she found that when you give children this utterance to imitate, he kicks the piggy, children are much more likely to produce this article in this position, where it can prosodify with a monosyllabic verb forming sort of a trochaic foot or a metrical unit. Then in this case, where the verb is disyllabic, it itself forms a trochaic foot, and the here, he catches the piggy, is left unprosodified. Okay? So in this case, children omit the determiner about 43% of the time. Here, they include the determiner 43% of the time. Here they include it 75% of the time. Okay? These are two-year-olds, 2 years, 3 months. So part of what seems to be going on here is just a slightly different representation. If you take every syllable and then give the one that is stressed an extra star here, then you have sort of a footing algorithm, basically. And the unfooted syllables tend to be deleted. Okay? This happens to be true not only for grammatical morphemes, but also for lexical items as well. So you've probably heard kids try and say banana, and typically they say something like nana, okay, until about 2.5. Okay. We found similar types of problems or phenomena in Sesotho, a southern Bantu language that I work on, where there are not determiners, but there are noun class prefixes, and there's about 15 of these. It depends on the Bantu language, okay? So here we have mo, this is a prefix for the word motu, which means person. But just to give you an idea here, the plural would be batu, okay? So there's a prefix alternation there. So in these cases where the stem is monosyllabic, children tend to include this prefix. But when the stem is disyllabic and already constitutes a foot, like in mosadi, then this mo prefix is dropped. Okay? So there's a lot of dropping of prefixes early on. A lot of lexical items are disyllabic, and so it takes children a while to acquire these morphemes. Coming from a syntactic perspective, people thought, oh, well, there's 13, 15 noun class prefixes. It takes children a while to figure out what gender class these nouns belong to, so that's the problem. Well, that doesn't explain why they're included in these cases and not in these cases. And furthermore, we find if we look at agreement, children are deleting or omitting the noun class prefix in on some disyllabic words, but they're including exactly the right reflex of the agreement form. So in this case, the target is le potolane. Actually, this is what the child says. it has a click in it. It's one of these click languages. Okay, so the target is Lepotlani, and the child says poko lane, but they say lane here instead of tane or some other agreement form. So they seem to understand what the phi features or the agreement features of the noun are, even when this prefix is missing. So that indicates that it's not a syntactic problem. Okay, they understand in the syntax of these issues. Something else is going on. So in some of our recent work and in other people's work, similar findings have been found in French. So it turns out that determiners tend to be first produced with monosyllabic nouns, again forming a foot. However, if you know anything about the prosodic structure of French, French has final stress or phrase final stress. If they're individual lexical items produced by themselves, this tends to be word final stress, okay, or duration or lengthening. And so what we find is exactly the same pattern as what we saw in the Sesotho case. If we have something like doulé, then the determiner there, and this is all determiners, not just articles, these are included, whereas something like la caronne, in this case, that la will actually be omitted. Okay? So exactly the same types of patterns that we saw in the Sesotho case in a language that prosodifies things a little bit differently. Nonetheless, there are these disyllabic feet, even though in one case they were head initial or trochaic, strong, weak feet, and in the French case they're weak, strong, iambic feet.
So does this mean that for most of the children, before they start producing la couronne, they're going to go through the stage where they just say couronne,
Yes.
but they say dulet?
Yes, exactly.
So exactly what
At the
happens
same time.
there.
At the same time. Yes. Yes. In fact, I took out the graph that showed this, but I could show you that later. Yeah. So given these Sesotho and French results from prosodically very different languages, and given the Gerken English experimental results, one of the things we wanted to do was look at children's development over time and see if we could find the same types of patterns as found in these other studies. So the Gerken results, which we've now replicated, were elicited production experimental types of tasks. Some people have criticized these, that they might induce sort of a rhythmic bias that might encourage children to omit determiners in those weak contexts. So we thought if we looked at spontaneous speech, that would be able to avoid those types of problems, and we could see how these things develop over time and when children no longer show this effect. So we've collected the providence corpus. This is a corpus of mother-child spontaneous speech interactions. 6 children between the ages of 1 and 3. We've recorded them every 2 weeks in their home for about an hour, some kids every week. They have radio mics on, so the child is mic'd and the parent is mic'd. And then we have transcribed all of this into Childis database format. You may or may not have heard of Brian McQuinney and the Childis database that has lots of child data. And so we should be releasing this within the next couple months. We're almost finished.
Oh, providence corpus, because the name grand corpus is already taken.
Well, yeah, yes. Well, see, the Demuth corpus is taken because I have a Sesotho database called the Demuth corpus. And then there is this Brown corpus, and then there's also the Roger Brown corpus of child speech. So Brown was sort of multiply, so we had to call it something else. And since we also were doing this in France, then so we decided to call it the Providence corpus and the Lyon corpus. Okay, so those are those 2 corpora. Yes, so you're absolutely right. Just to avoid any ambiguity, yeah. So this is, I'll just play this little clip for you here. Here's a 2-year-old and her mother. If we can, I think I need to click once. Let's try it again. Okay, so here you can hopefully hear that the third person singular morphemes here are missing. Okay, very clearly dog eat if we were actually listening with headphones. Okay. So the participants in this database were 5 of the children who had enough tokens. One child is sort of a later talker and didn't have enough tokens. These are the 5 children. These are the ages that we looked at. Basically, we looked starting at when determiners first started to appear. Again, these are articles. And going until both the footed and unfooted ones occurred about 60% of the time. So the age range here is about 4 months or so for each child. MLU is mean length of utterance. As you can see, the ages are a little bit different for the children. So mean length of utterance provides another way of sort of normalizing across children, across those who are faster and slower. And so this is in words. So this is mean of 1.7 words per utterance up to around 2.5 or 3 here. And these are the number of tokens then that we examined. In blue are the ones that were in the footed case. These should be the easy ones, according to the Gerken and other studies. And in pink are the unfooted ones. Okay, so you can see that there's more unfooted tokens here than footed tokens. And this is where we'll see that children actually will do better on the less frequent footed ones than they do on the more frequent unfooted ones. Okay? So these are color-coded. The same color scheme will be throughout. So in all cases, the blue in future will be the footed cases that we expect children to be able to produce fairly well, and the unfooted ones are the harder ones. Okay. So what I want to do now is just run you through some graphs, some longitudinal developmental graphs of each of the children. Given that the bulk of the data, in some cases, not for this child, but in some of the other cases, is with the unfooted ones, what I'll show you first is just a graph of all the determiners altogether. Okay? This is typically what syntacticians use. They'll look at percent use of a grammatical morpheme in obligatory contexts. All right? So I'll show you that first, and then I'll pull them apart. Just a little bit on the coding. What we did was identify all target contexts where a determiner was obligatory. Any ambiguous cases we threw out. We had the video, we had the audio, we had the context. And then we coded them for footed or unfooted contexts and whether they were produced or not. Okay, and good reliability. Okay, so these are just some examples. Dressed up like a, which, okay, so the there is footed, etc. throughout here. It's a lamb, where's the cake? And these are examples of unfooted ones. Watching the cat, a puzzle piece, a bulldozer, etc. So we expect the footed ones to occur first, and we expect the full curve to mirror the unfooted ones. So here's the first child. The age is plotted across the bottom here, and this is the percent of determiners actually produced. Of those in an obligatory context where there should be a determiner, what percent is produced. So you can see that she starts out around 20% or so, and then gradually she was quite precocious. So around 1 year, 7 months, she's up around 80% overall. Okay? Now we'll pull them apart. So here you can see that the unfooted ones are pretty low and gradually rise, again following the curve a little bit lower than what we saw previously, whereas the footed ones are being produced significantly better than the unfooted ones. And this is the pattern that we see again and again. So here's the next child, and we pull them apart. Here's the next child, and we pull them apart. Here's the next child, and we pull them apart. Okay, pretty systematic, nice patterns that basically replicate Gerken's findings. These are somewhat younger kids, although this one is about the same as the ones in her study. Okay, so very, very similar patterns to what was found in the experimental findings.
Am I saying correctly that in the unfooted case, it consistently goes down at first?
At first?
When
Does
I saw
it-
that on your first, is it only 2?
Yeah, this one's flat, and some of those may not be significant. Yeah, these are flat. Yeah, yeah. So in this case, where there is a dip there, it may not be significant. From 30 down to 17, it may not be significant there. Yeah. But then we have Lily. Okay, so you notice Lily's pattern is a little bit different. Notice the other ones all tended to be this type of a curve. Lily's curve overall is a bit different. So we suspect something else is going on here. And sure enough, when we pull them apart, it looks quite a bit different from what we found with the other children. So there's no difference in her production of footed and unfooted determiners. Her unfooted ones are much higher than we saw for the other kids earlier on. And her footed ones are lower than what we saw for the other kids until 2 years old, at which point there begins to be a significant difference between those two. So what's going on with this kid? See, this kid would be lost in an experimental, when you've got 16 kids, this would be washed out in the, we wouldn't see this type of individual variation. So our initial hypothesis was confirmed for at least 4 of the children. We found exactly the same patterns that we had predicted and that other people have found. Lily showed a different pattern. So we wondered if her initial determiners were stressed. When we were coding for these, we had noted that the transcribers had an initial stress mark there. Now, stress is not very reliably coded, and so it's difficult to do this perceptually. But it was interesting that critically, she seemed to be coded with these stress marks and other kids didn't. So we wondered if she was treating these determiners as separate prosodic units. But to determine this, we needed to do acoustic analyses. So what we did was look at her time period at 1 year, 10 months, and then at the 2-year stage. And we took samples, all the samples that we could that were good, clean acoustic forms, and we measured the distance between its and or whatever the preceding word was, and okay, the determiner. And then we also measured the distance between and the following word, or the, as the case may be. And so we predicted that perhaps what would happen is that at these early stages, she was just producing as a separate prosodic unit, just with like stress on it. But that over time, by 2 years old, she would begin to actually include the determiner with the preceding word and actually foot it into a prosodic constituent. Okay. So let me play these for you, and you can hear these examples actually show that, exactly what we had thought. So, yeah. So you can even hear that it sounds almost as though there's like a demi-breath in between here. Okay. Whereas for the second one,
it's a Coke.
Okay, very clearly all together. And then we also, so we predicted that this would shorten over the time. And the green here, we didn't really have any expectations. We thought it might get a little longer here as it does in this example, but we didn't have any strong expectations there. We also then looked at the unfooted cases. And again, we didn't know quite what to predict here. Here, over time, this one gets shorter, but we didn't quite know what to predict here. I'll just play these, and you can hear what they sound like. These are the unfooted. No, that's a pretty long one.
The bill.
Let me try to get in.
The bill.
Okay. You can see here she's even done she's made this almost into 2 syllables. Okay. So here's the footed case, and indeed these are mean values for all the tokens. You see very, very strongly there's a big, this is duration in milliseconds, there's a great decrease in the gap between the first word and the determiner over time. as we expected might be the case. So that indicates that she really is beginning to foot these things. The duration between the determiner and the following noun seems to get a little bit lengthened, as in those first examples we showed you, but it's not significant. And the duration for the unfooted cases between the determiner and the noun doesn't change over time. And critically, we can see that these are the same at the first point. So it looks like Lily is really learning how to prosodify these things into a foot. We know that from other studies that children's utterances can tend to be overly stressed, okay? And that initial syllables, initial unstressed syllables have different prosodic properties, sometimes until children are about 4 years old. So we think that maybe part of what Lily is showing is sort of the syllable-timed rather than a stress-timed approach to some of her early speech. And this may be due to slower speech rates, shorter breath groups, things of that sort over time. We also notice, however, that at 2 years old, she's beginning for the first time to produce words like banana. So the research assistant's name was Manuela, same prosodic structure as banana, sort of an unstressed, stressed, unstressed syllable. And Manuela was always wella, 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 wella until 2. And all of a sudden at 2 she became Manuela. So we think part of what's going on here is that if we look at the prosodic hierarchy, here we have feet and phonological words and phonological phrases, but these are embedded in larger phonological utterances and intonational phrases. Part of what's going on here is that the child is learning about all of these different levels of prosodic structure and is learning how to reorganize her utterances into some of these units. So here initially at 1-8, she had its as a separate foot or prosodic word, and as a separate prosodic word, and bag as a separate prosodic word. But then at 2 years, she had itza becoming a coordinated prosodic unit, and Manuela also becoming a more fully fledged prosodic unit. So in summary, most children exhibit excellent production of footed English determiners quite early on. However, the reliable production of unfooted determiners takes quite a bit longer to learn. So we think that this basically provides support for the prosodic licensing hypothesis, where there's earlier licensing of prosodically unmarked grammatical morphemes. What about alternative explanations? Could it be a processing account? Maybe the utterances where the determiners are actually produced are shorter than those that are longer. So maybe there's a non-linguistic explanation for these issues. Maybe some of these footed units are really collocations. Maybe they're not really analyzed. Or maybe there's some utterance initial types of effects with a bag, a dog, things like that that are playing a role here. Well, for a processing account, we would actually predict that this does not handle the phenomena that we found here. And in fact, even if we take these very simple cases, the footed cases are going to be longer. But we went ahead and looked at this, and we found that if we took mean MLU, so mean number of words per utterance, the footed cases for all of the children were significantly longer than the unfooted cases. So this means that the context in which the children are actually trying to produce determiners are actually longer than those where they omit them. If we look at the utterances where they actually produce them, we find very, very similar pattern. So this would argue strongly against the possibility that children are only omitting determiners in longer types of utterances. Yes?
Is this difference in length measured in terms of the sort of standard form or the form the child produces?
Both. So this is the target, what the child is trying to say, and this is what the child actually says. Right. So you can see that there's a slight increase of the pink lines here. So in fact, that means that given an utterance, children are actually producing more determiners in the utterances that they actually produce than in the actual targets themselves for the unfooted cases.
And is length measured in number of syllables, or?
So far, we've measured here numbers of words. So we are going to do now just a target, just take a slice, like the second session for each of the kids, and calculate that in terms of numbers of syllables. I suspect there won't be much difference since most of the high-frequency words in English are monosyllabic. So I think our graphs will look very similar to this. But that's something to check out. And in fact, that's an issue that some people have wondered about, say, for the French or for the Sesotho. Yeah. So at least so far, we find no evidence for a processing account, and if anything, it goes the other direction, which is sort of surprising. Maybe these things are collocations. Maybe these things aren't determiners. Maybe they're just etc. However, as you saw from some of the examples, children are using a number of lexical items there. And in fact, you could use the same argument for a ball, a dog, whatever. And so we think that a collocation explanation of these data doesn't fly. Furthermore, in Spanish, some of my data show that there are cases where there's a target, la muñeca, the doll, okay, and children say things like ameca, where they essentially omit this first syllable. In this case, the m gets added on there instead of the nya, okay? But the child is omitting a syllable of the lexical item to include the determiner, okay? So this, again, would, children don't hear this, ever. And yet, in this case, they're obviously producing something that meets their prosodic requirements. Okay? So these types of crosslinguistic data also mediate sort of against a collocation effect. What about utterance initial effects? Perhaps weak initial syllables at beginnings of utterances are more susceptible to omission, but this is true of lexical items as well. So this doesn't seem to be something that's particularly true of grammatical function items, and we know that with lexical items this happens in all positions as well. So we think that this doesn't actually explain the data either. This seems to be really a prosodic effect as opposed to an utterance initial type of effect. So we think that there's increased use of determiners due to increasing ability to coordinate productions at higher levels of structure. This is true with morphologically complex and simple prosodic words. And it's true also with adding more words or prosodic words within an utterance. Obviously, these are a higher level of structure. We think also that this helps account for cross-linguistic differences in production. So there's been some interesting bilingual studies done by Tanja Kupisch at University of Hamburg, where she's looked at Romance German, so Italian German and French German bilingual children. And she finds that they learn the determiners earlier in the Romance languages than they do in the Germanic languages. We think that this is true because in German, many of the determiners tend to be acquired later, even in monolinguals, than we see in some other languages, in part because a determiner has to be a separate prosodic word, das Mädchen, okay, where it's this full lexical item. It can't, or it doesn't prosodify in the same types of ways that it does in, say, Spanish or French. So we think that that's one of the reasons why determiners tend to be acquired later there. So what about the implications for other grammatical items? Is this just a phenomena of determiners? Or do we see sort of prosodic licensing of grammatical morphemes in other contexts? Well, as I mentioned earlier, one of the other contexts where children variably produce grammatical morphemes is third-person singular. especially in English. This has received lots of attention. Here's just an example from one of our children at 2 years, 2 months. She says, "Mommy tries to do," and then with an S, and then she says, "Mommy need to go to the hospital," with no S. So, okay, yes, this utterance is longer here, but it looks like this is a more general phenomena that needs to be explained. It's also been found in children with language delay that there's protracted acquisition of these morphemes. There's been some research showing that children with specific language impairment produce past tense morphemes much more systematically on something like sewed than they do on yelled, where there's an LD cluster, consonant cluster, and worse on a case like danced. So the increasing phonotactic complexity in this case seems to have a detrimental effect on the production of the past tense morpheme. So we wondered if we would find the same types of effects for third person singular. In other words, would children be better at producing the S in something like C's, where it's preceded by a vowel, than in something like hits, where it forms a consonant cluster. So for the 2 children that we have sufficient data in our corpus, we analyzed these types of forms, and we found that this is exactly the same, the case. So here's the data for Naima. This is percent S production in the simple case like C's, and in the complex case like hits. And you can see that, especially early on, there's quite a difference. This is, again, a very precocious child, but quite a difference in production of third-person singular here. And the same for another very precocious child as well. Okay. Yes?
Did you look at the frequency of the phonotactic sequence? Because TS sequence would be much more frequent, I imagine.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes, in fact, TS is one of the highest frequency ones. So stop S is the highest, is much more frequent than, say, nasal S, et cetera. Yeah, and I think TS is probably one of the highest frequency, because T is the highest frequency coded consonant in English. Yeah, so those would be the easiest. You would expect those to be the easiest. Yeah, but they seem to be harder than others. In terms of, so I thought you were going to ask about lexical frequency. Right. Yes. So there have been some other people who have shown that there are, neighborhood effects. So if you take the entire rhyme of the syllable, that the vowel plus consonant is a better predictor of, in novel forms that a child has never heard before, how well they do at producing that actual VC sequence. I don't think anybody has actually done sort of neighborhood density types of effects in looking at morphological structures.
Has anybody done any work on this sort of thing with made-up words?
With like novel or nonce words? Yes, exactly. In the simple coda cases, yes, they have. So some work by Tanya Zamener and colleagues has actually looked at that. But I don't think anybody's looked at the morphological cases.
How about differences in, like unaccusative verbs, for instance, are hard to learn? I mean, some people say that.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of observation about?
I think the thing there to look at would be actual verb frequency. And we have looked at verb frequency. It turns out that the simple cases like see, there are not many verbs that are just consonant vowel, but they occur with very high frequency. So there's many more of these complex cases. So the overall frequency, if you calculate on tokens, the overall frequency of the simple cases and the complex cases are the same. But if you look at types, there are many more complex types than there are simple types. So that says nothing about unaccusativity. We haven't looked at that. We've just sort of looked at frequency of the verbs themselves. Yeah. So we're actually running experiments on this now. And it's been hard to come up with picturable verbs of this type. But we have lots of picturable verbs of this type to choose from. So we're trying to tease some of this apart now with actually doing some experiments. So we have some preliminary evidence from longitudinal data that there seem to be prosodic licensing of the determiners, some past tense, but also third-person singular s. If this is the case, and if this is the case more generally, this really indicates that children may have earlier knowledge of morphosyntactic structure than is typically assumed. Okay? Since, remember those early curves that I showed you with the determiners really underestimate some of children's knowledge here, it may be that children really know more than we give them credit for. Obviously, we need to investigate the limits of these prosodic explanations by looking at other grammatical morphemes. Also, as you've seen, this variability diminishes around 3 years, 2 years, 3 months, or 2.5, something like that. So the prosodic restrictions won't account for some of the variability that happens after that point. So there's age limitations here as well. And of course, some of the frequency effects need to be further investigated. In general, there's been very little research on the acquisition of prosodic structure. Most of it has looked only at lexical items. There's been very little work looking at the morphology, phonology interface. To do this, we really need a better characterization, acoustic characterization of what the input is that children actually hear. So we know that there are robust cues to child-directed speech of various sorts, and yet we still know relatively little about some of that with respect to looking at grammatical morphemes. We really need a better model of the prosodic representation of both function and content words in both child-directed speech and adult-directed speech. There's been, again, a little bit of work done on this. People at MIT have been working on some of the adult, just plain old adult types of speech, but there are many other issues to be examined. So we've toyed with the possibility of perhaps thinking about whether it would be useful to do some forced alignment of large corpora. The providence and the Lyon corpus might be a place to start on some of that, since we have relatively good acoustic quality on it. I guess it remains to be seen if we find any tools that are really useful for doing this on a large basis. Some of this work also indicates that we need better models of speech planning. So some of the people at MIT have been working on various perception and production models of speech, looking at acoustic gestural types of features that might be used for both. So there are a number of issues about what speakers actually do to ensure that there's a good phonetic percept for their hearers. Again, we know relatively little about how that process works, and one of the issues we're potentially interested in addressing in children also is how are these things finessed. So in particular, when children are leaving off the third person singular, do they lengthen the vowel, or do they lengthen the word in any way, or do they indicate any other spectral properties that might indicate that there's an S there that maybe we can't actually hear but might be there in the acoustic signal. So there are a number of questions about speech planning and development that we're interested in addressing. So in conclusion, what I've tried to show here is that prosodically licensed determiners are the first to appear in early speech. The prosodic licensing hypothesis provides a principled explanation for the early variable appearance of at least some grammatical function items, both within and across languages. This raises the possibility that children may exhibit earlier grammatical competence than often assumed. And if that's the case, then in doing various types of syntactic research, one should really be controlling for some of these factors. And finally, we need better models of language planning in both adults, children, and probably also in speech generation. Thanks. Questions? Yes, Bob.
So you basically talked about two types of phenomena. The most of the time you spent on these metrical phenomena, and then when you talked about the third-person singular morpheme, you were talking about complexity of consonant clusters. So in the first case, you made an analogy between omitting grammatical words and omitting syllables, where single words were more complex. Do you see the same analogy holding in the second case?
So if we look at monomorphemic words that have consonant clusters. Yes. So we have done that with, let's see, did we do novel words? I think we used real words in that case. So we did experiments with 2-year-olds looking at consonant clusters. Interestingly, there has been a lot of research looking at onset consonant clusters. So I think the speech pathologists do this all the time. You know, Susie, instead of saying slip, she says sip, and it persists for a long period of time. And so there's been a lot of work looking at onset clusters across a number of languages, German, Dutch, English, whatever. There's been practically no research done on children's acquisition of word final clusters. And so we did do a study with known words, looking at those. One of the difficulties there is that some of the consonant clusters that you find word finally only occur in morphologically complex forms, or there are very few lexical items that are monomorphemic. So fox and box and sock, well, no, socks, there we get morphologically complex. So there are some of those where you actually get a stop followed by an S. But it's hard to find high-frequency lexical items that children would know that are monomorphemic. So one possible way well, what we did find is that children, English-speaking children, are acquiring word-final consonant clusters, be they monomorphemic or bimorphemic, earlier than onset clusters. So one possibility is that this is a frequency effect because they are more frequent if you take the morphological cases into account. Another possibility is that it's a morphological effect and that children are aware of the morphology. We were looking especially at nouns. Plurals are acquired quite early in English, and so you get a lot of cases where there are consonant S for plurals in English. And those are very, very frequent. In fact, they're more frequent to have a cluster in those cases than not for plurals, for nouns. So those don't seem to present a problem for children, which is interesting given the third-person singular, because if the plurals aren't a problem but the third-person singular are, then it's not a consonant cluster problem. So again, one can think about, so there's probably semantic issues there as to why the third-person singular later, but there are probably also frequency issues because plurals are whoppingly more frequent than third-person singular morphemes. So there's a number of factors that would explain that type of difference. But just given, say, looking at third-person singular or clusters in general, it looks like the clusters aren't the problem. So it seems that the third-person singular has a number of factors making those consonant clusters much more fragile. Yes?
Were those children in the community, or were they children of university households? Or
oh, these are community. Yeah.
Is the dialect in that area like the one that we encountered in upstate New York, where you don't distinguish between can and can?
What?
Between can and can't.
Oh, can and can't.
Where it's actually glottalized, where in actual fact final T's, for example, are glottalized, there's a whole series of final consonants that are just dropped.
No, the final consonants are basically there. So this is sort of southern New England dialect. In African American speech, some of those final consonants tend not to be there, especially T and D. But most of our kids were not African American and didn't speak that dialect. There are some interesting vowel issues in that dialect, but not with the consonants. However, you bring up an interesting point, because we all probably in this room tend to delete some of those consonants more than we realize. So for instance, in something like, oh, hand me the book. You think hand, N-D, but the D isn't there at all. And the N isn't there either, because it's become an M. And so you have hand me the book, maybe with a longer M. And so there are those types of processes that happen in everyday speech all the time, which means that, again, children are getting variable types of input in learning some of these things. Even in the...
My favorite of that one is the English teacher who refused to teach her students colloquial American English, where I'm not going to do X comes out as I'm not gonna, with a final K and not a T.
Oh, well, good luck.
I'm not gonna do that.
Right. Yeah, so that, I think there are lots of issues about what is there in the acoustic speech stream, and obviously we as adult speakers of language use a lot of top-down information about what is actually being said, and we use that to parse the ongoing speech. For more naive learners, be it second language learners or first language learners who don't have a large lexicon, that a lot of that top-down information isn't as readily available for doing that type of parsing. So yeah, it raises some interesting issues there. Yeah.
Has child-directed speech been studied from that point of view? My intuition is that people are more careful in child-directed speech than in adult-to-adult speech.
Yes and no. So a lot of these issues haven't been. People have looked at this issue or that issue, but at a much larger perspective, a lot of those things aren't as well known. So there has been a little bit of work done looking at sort of targeted issues in child-directed speech. One of the problems is a certain amount of variability. And so what do you consider to be the norm? And people have looked somewhat at how that changes over time with the age of the child. So there's been some work looking at speech to 9 months to, say, 1-year-olds. I think that's the Bernstein-Ratner corpus that Michael Brandt used for some of his computational work looking at word segmentation problems. There has been relatively little looking at older kids, like, say, 1-year-olds, 1.5-year-olds, 2-year-olds. So that's why we're thinking that perhaps some of the corpora that we have might be useful for, again, probably starting out addressing specific types of issues, but providing a more robust type of understanding of what the input actually looks like. We also suspect that there may be some of those individual differences may facilitate learning for some kids. So, again, this is a very small corpus, but one of our parents spoke very, very slowly. And that child was, very, very quick at learning all kinds of words. Maybe that facilitates segmentation early on. And again, you'd need a much larger sample. You'd need much more controlled type of speech. So we're actually, one of my grad students back at Brown is actually doing some experiments now, manipulating the speech stream, introducing words and looking at how quickly, I think it's 19-month-olds, so that'd be 1 year, 7 months, actually look to a screen given a variable speech rate. And she's also going to be looking at where the lexical atom is actually embedded in the speech stream to see if final words are learned earlier in certain types of speech rate or certain types of other acoustic parameters that we can actually vary. So I think probably those types of experiments will be more fruitful in trying to look at what learners respond to. That's not going to tell us a whole lot about what child-directed speech actually looks like. Yes.
Studies about like very, very early infancy, like pre-language.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, newborns, a month older. So how sensitive they are to prosodic clues? Because I mean, since you,
right.
Since your research kind of indicates that the competence is there much earlier than
yeah.
one would think.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of working with 4-day-olds all the way up, looking at various aspects of what they're sensitive to. I think low-pass filtered speech, 4-day-olds can tell if you're speaking French or English. So there's some pretty early sensitivities to those types of issues. And people have looked at various other aspects, like even if you familiarize a child to one voice and then you change the voice but have the same stimuli. I think it's at 6 months old, they don't recognize it, but at 8 months old they do in a different voice. So there's a whole slew of studies looking at what aspects of the acoustic signal learners tend to be sensitive to or can normalize for in terms of trying to pick out invariant cues to various aspects of the speech stream and or how that becomes phonologized or phoneticized over time. Things like that.
Is there anything specific on the metric organization?
On metrical organization, there have been studies by Peter Juzik and others showing, I think, at 6 months that English-speaking kids prefer to listen to trochaic feet rather than iambic feet. So they will pick out, so they have difficulties in a running speech stream picking out guitar, which is iambic, weak, strong. Whereas
replicated this with French children to see if it goes the other way.
French, I'm not sure, but a number of the studies that one would want to replicate with French have been unsuccessful, and people aren't quite sure why. So I'm not sure if they've done that one, but I know some of the other studies with French-speaking babies, they don't show the same effects that English-speaking babies do earlier on, and some of that, so it may be that on the, stress is a good cue in English to finding the beginnings of words, but you don't have some of those same types of cues in French, and so it may be, maybe French-speaking kids actually don't use those types of cues early on. They use other cues. So we were running experiments in French, and we found that the experiment was going, c'est une poupée, with this pitch accent on the first syllable of the word. And it turns out, so, an English-speaking postdoc who was there said, don't give it added stress on the first syllable. And the postdoc who was running the study said, but that's how we speak. And so sure enough, as you look through literature, there is this pitch accent on the first syllable of some lexical items, at least, but it's highly variable.
French Childdirected.
In French, well, maybe even in French, if you're introducing a new lexical item.
Introducing a new lexical item, I see.
But it's variable. And so, but it's not duration that you get later on. And so in English, we tend to think of duration, pitch, and amplitude as all being on the same syllable. Obviously, in other languages, these don't all co-occur in the same types of ways. And so it could be that French-speaking babies are picking up on a pitch accent as information to the beginnings of words, and I'm not sure if that's actually been tested. Yeah.
All languages be characterized as either trochaic or iambic?
Yes.
You haven't been told.
Well, yeah, yes. But there are variations there on as well. So some languages have bounded feet, so they're disyllabic feet, either iambic or trochaic, and other languages have unbounded feet. So in fact, French is a case of an unbounded foot type of language where you don't get these metrical units in the same types of way that you do in English. Which is then again interesting that we find some of these disyllabic limits on the incorporation of early determiners then. So you have unbounded feet and bounded binary feet, and you have trochaic and iambic feet. And then there are languages like Japanese, where it has been proposed. Bill Poser has done work showing that, in fact, even Japanese has feet. So probably yes.
Like Chinese, are there studies for Chinese? Because they are very monosyllabic word.
Well, but those can be feet. So, I mean, even in English, the monosyllables typically are...
But then they have also the tone.
Right. But tone, yeah. So there's sort of different levels of prosodic structure, and sometimes higher level tonal units will be isomorphic. I mean, they don't map directly onto feet. And in other cases, there is interaction between those different levels of prosodic structure. So the tone needn't necessarily be diagnostic of actual foot structure. Yeah. Yeah. So Bantu languages are a good example of this, where you get all kinds of tonal systems, and in some languages they actually link into some of the prosodic constituency, in others they don't. Yeah. Yes.
So this kind of, the phonological licensing, principle work for adult second language learning.
Yes. Good point. In fact, there's quite a bit of bilingual research going on in Montreal with French-English learners, but also others like Chinese learners of English. And there's been a series of papers that have come out of there. In fact, one was just presented at Boston University, and showing that you do get exactly these same types of effects. And some of their work is on determiners, the same type of thing. Also, some of the phonotactics, some of the third-person singular and past tense marking as well. So especially languages that only have simple CV types of syllable structures, you get a lot of these phonotactic types of effects there. Yeah.
Another question that I had is, this one was overt kind of grammatical markers, but in the case of, say, Japanese, we have the covert case, the covert grammatical markers. So the licensing works for covert markers as well. I mean, case drops, for instance. It's a licensing process. And
licensed by adjacency.
So I was just wondering whether this principle works for covert case as opposed to overt markers.
I guess one would have to actually look at that. I think it sort of depends on what the licensing cases are. So in cases across languages where you see optional appearance of grammatical morphemes, I think the real question is what are the licensing factors? So there's an interesting case of in this Bantu language that I work on, Sesotho, there's these noun class prefixes, and I told you that the ones occurring before monosyllables occur first, and the others tend to be omitted. But when we started looking at this more systematically, we found that, yes, that holds until 2 years, 3 months. However, it turns out that adults also variably produce some, or variably omit some of these noun class prefixes. So then the question is, why and what's licensing it? And what we've found is that only a subset, only 4 out of the 13 can be dropped. They're phonologically licensed. They're only the ones that begin with a coronal consonant. And they can only be dropped when they're followed by agreement in a C-command relationship with agreement. So there's syntactic licensing. And that only happens when the noun that's being talked about is old or given information. It's not contrastive or new or whatever information. So the variability in adult use of these morphemes is phonologically, syntactically, and discourse conditioned. Those are the licensing conditions there. And so in addition to the prosodic constraints I talked about here, the learners have to learn that only for this subset you can then, quote unquote, optionally, but it's not optional, it's licensed here. And we have really nice data showing that by 2.5, these kids know that. You can see some phonological overgeneralization, you can see some syntactic overgeneralization, and otherwise, by 2.5 they've got it. So this is a really interesting case where learners are presented with a lot of variability in the input and have to determine, okay, what are the constraining or licensing factors? So yeah, I think in any of these cases, that's what we need to know. Yeah. But it could be that in some cases there is variability that is only conditioned by phonological prosodic types of issues as well.
Okay.
Other questions? Thank you.